glad you can all hear me. That's a good sign. So welcome to this this section of the conference. I hope you've all enjoyed the day thus far. We've had some really, really great papers, and as was the case last year. Oh, hi, Teresa. As was the case last year, it's proven to be a really, really wonderful conference. It's very different to other conferences that I'm sure we're all used to. So first we have Ben, Amy, Liz, and Celine, and they will be given a paper today, Class: The Career Journey in Psychology. So I will pop 15 minutes on my timer, and I'll give you just a 1-minute prompt just to sort of say, you know, wrap up towards the end. So I'll hand over to you guys. There you go.
Thank you, Laura. So just to introduce myself, I'm Ben Campbell. I'm a clinical psychologist working in Ireland, and I'm here today with Celine, Liz, and Amy. I was going to get you all to introduce yourselves, but just in the sake of speed, I might just crack through this. So we're all kind of involved in psychology in some form. So some of us are post-qualification, some of us are kind of coming into the profession. And ClassClinPsych kind of started just from there being quite a bit of frustration and feeling a little bit like definitely working class voices just weren't really being heard in the profession that we were in. I kind of set this up probably about a year ago along with my colleague Will Curvis, and it kind of just grew out of very informal conversations about frustrations that we had in the profession and just kind of things that we noticed. It has grown since then into something where we have I don't even know how many, but we've got like a good crowd of us who are all involved in different aspects of this work, and a few of the folks are here today to kind of talk about what we've been doing. But we essentially it's grown from being a kind of a frustrated conversation in supervision one-to-one into something where we've hosted a few webinars on just the experience of class in psychology professions. We've talked a little bit about kind of intersectionality and just issues relating to like disability and maybe just less visible difference and class. And we've also collected some data just about the kind of conversations that we've had, the feedback that we've had through social media and different forums. And we're just keen to suppose to get the work that we've done out there. So just in terms of just chatting briefly about what we kind of know. So we know that what are called kind of top professions tend to be quite heavy towards people who have maybe a more privileged background. So we know that even when working class students do get to university, and even when they do really, really well at university, it still tends to be that they're underrepresented in kind of top professions. So professions like academia, medicine, architecture, and very much in psychology. And I think sometimes there is a perception that, you know, this is definitely a meritocracy and you can kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but a lot of the data tells us that just isn't the case. You know, that if your parents are doctors and you go into medicine, you're much more likely to become a doctor yourself. If your parents are architects, you're much more likely to go on and do architecture if that's what you choose to do. And a lot of the kind of data, so the graph that's here is just from the labour force survey, I think from 2017. All the data that's in that report kind of reflects that. It reflects, I suppose, some of the anecdotal frustrated conversations that I was definitely having with other people in the profession. So psychology is absolutely not immune to this at all. And if you're not familiar with kind of the career journey in clinical psychology, it's incredibly competitive. So there's a huge amount of applicants for a very, very tiny amount of training places. Training's fully funded via the NHS, so that puts like an added incentive for people to apply and strive and do their very best to kind of get onto clinical training. And it's definitely held up as being, the be all and end all in terms of psychology. And there are obviously other career routes in psychology, but I suppose this all started with a focus on clinical, because that's where me and Will were at. The kind of workforce data for clinical psychology would kind of reflect that usually historically the workforce has definitely been very white, very middle class, and majority female. And that is something that has stayed quite static through time. So that there have been efforts to kind of increase diversity and increase inclusion. But the workforce tends to be quite similar. It's stayed quite the same. And a lot of the pre-qualification kind of anxiety and pressure is reflected in the huge amount of kind of cottage industry things that there are, where you can pay someone to help you to do your application, you can pay someone to prep you for your interview, you can work for free if you're so inclined, if you're able to do that. And there's a lot of these kind of inbuilt, quite unfair advantages for some folks who can pay for it. And I suppose that's something else that we've reflected on as being quite unfair, and kind of tipping this, maybe not tipping the scales, but definitely keeping that static workforce quite static. And we've had conversations with people from other professions in psychology and other professions just outside of psychology that reflect something similar, that there's definitely something about networking and who you know and who your parents are, that definitely has kind of a maybe an unseen impact on who gets into what profession and what that's like. So, as I said, the webinars really started with no set theme. It was very much winging it, just seeing what happened, and we were definitely just taken aback by the audiences, just the amount of people that came through to watch the webinars in person and then rewatch them again on YouTube. And it seemed to ignite a conversation that had definitely been happening in other forums, but it just seemed to bring lots and lots of people together. And we eventually kind of put out a call to see if anyone would be interested in getting involved with just our little kind of collective, and we got a whole lot of people who were dead interested. So it feels like it's captured kind of a common feeling amongst lots of different people at different stages through the psychology career, and people who maybe haven't considered psychology as a career because of some of the things I've just mentioned. But it seems to just have generated a really lovely kind of conversation between a whole wide range of people. Okay. I think this is Liz.
Hi. So I'm just going to talk a bit about our findings and how we plan to encapsulate the meaning behind the webinars. So to start with, there were 5 of us in the report writing group, and so that was Amy, Celine, myself, Katie and Sarah, who aren't here today. So we each took one of the 5 webinars that had been broadcast at that point and transcribed what was said into a Word document. So the 5 webinars were Intersections with Mental Health, Discussing Disability, and the August, July and June webinars. And from this, we conducted an informal qualitative analysis based on Bourne and Clark's thematic analysis framework. And we also looked at emails, tweets that used the ClassClinPsych hashtag, and feedback from the SurveyMonkey questionnaires sent around after each webinar. So from this, we identified 7 main themes. So the main themes were intersectionality. So visible and invisible parts of a person's identity all intersect. And this has been cited in other literature. So Lovett and Lovett found that an understanding of class is best achieved when looking at barriers and challenges from a number of other systemic hurdles, like race and gender, as well as issues of inequality, poverty, and systemic bias as a result of class. And the second theme was being middle class. So how being working class in a middle class profession can affect your sense of self and identity, both at university and at home. The third theme was shame, so purgative societal narratives around being working class. So how being working class is portrayed in a negative way, and the feelings this leads to within oneself. The fourth theme, social capital. So it's not what you know, it's who you know. Theme 5, which kind of links this, economic capital. So the impact of a lack of economic capital. So more research from Ray described the benefits of social and economic capital that comes with being from a more middle class background. So in terms of knowledge of routes into different careers and access to guidance, advice and mentorship that may not be available to those from a working class background. The sixth theme was molding self, so changing parts of yourself to fit the mold. And the last one was professional values, so being working class enriches the profession, and the ways being working class does enrich the profession in psychology. So to date, we have had 6,697 YouTube views of all the webinars that are on there, which is pretty good.
Thanks, Liz. So one of the we talked a wee bit about the kind of the themes that have come through from the data that we collected and the analysis that we kind of looked at. But there was this really powerful kind of just general narrative just around being kind of an outsider, like feeling like an outsider when you get to uni, feeling like an outsider as an undergrad, as a postgrad, navigating these kind of very complex career pathways where it felt like there was a lot of kind of unspoken or unnamed hurdles and kind of barriers. And this kind of manifested itself in a really weird, a really strange Twitter moment where somebody was talking about kind of, you know, having a chippy tea on a Friday night. So like, you know, getting together with their family and then someone making kind of an offhand comment about kind of nutrition or something like that, but just it leading to a huge just general discussion around food and shame and how you speak and how you dress, you know, where you live, where you went to school, who you know, who you don't know, and I think that it's a really hard thing to capture, but this kind of quote from Patricia Collins kind of speaks to that this idea of just being the outsider within it not feeling really intimidating, but being that outsider within holding quite a lot of strength and the power, I suppose, to be objective and observe the system that you're entering, as well as reflect on the system that you've come from. And it's just interesting how, you know, we can dress this up with, you know, a quote and a reference and stuff like that, but the conversation happened so naturally and it centered on something really basic, just food, dinner on a Friday night. And just it just launched kind of a really interesting kind of powerful narrative about what it's like to have to experience judgment about your family and your family relationships, how your family eat, which I think spoke to just so many people. And it definitely alludes to, I suppose, a deeper narrative that Liz has mentioned just around shame and kind of maybe holding on to a sense of either having to hide or disguise your roots and where you've come from.
Yeah. Hi everyone, it's great to be here. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the actionable insights that came out of the themes. So we wanted the position statement to kind of generate a bit of a discussion, a bit of a like movement, and maybe some actions towards a better psychology, and just in general a bit more awareness of working class people in professional arenas. So I know Ben's spoke a little bit about what it's like to try and fit in, and I think, you know, we can all relate to having experienced a feeling of like not belonging, maybe that we don't deserve the position we're in, that it's not for people like us, or maybe that we've chanced our way in there and, you know, we're going to be found out and kicked out any second for having a chippy tea on a Friday. So I think that it's important to like recognize that imposter syndrome that people are like working class people in particular have internalized is a further barrier to success, because it can, you know, present in your interviews the way you feel less confident when you're portraying yourself to a potential employer, maybe the way you don't relate to people who dress a certain way or have certain middle class hobbies as well. And we wanted to make to kind of make some actionable insights as to how like this can be corrected, and we can draw attention to imposter syndrome and try to bust that a little bit and, you know, get rid of it. So one of them was making selection, like the process of selection, more transparent. So if it's like more clear how courses and employers are making these decisions, then maybe people won't think that they've just chanced their way in there, and they can see like where things are diverse and inclusive. And then also increasing visibility in schools, particularly schools and colleges that have working class young people. And then finally, just opening the discussion around class and privilege. So over the past year, we have had like such a huge response to ClassClinPsych, and it shows that people really appreciate this space.
Okay, so hi everyone. Kind of moving on from that, many of the people who were working class also expressed that they didn't have the connections that other people might have. So they might have not have connections with people within the career or others that have completed university education. So due to this, people may not know the route to the further education or how to further their chosen career. So they don't have the advantage that others might have from a middle class background, which allow them to progress, such as family being able to support them in the university process, or others within the profession that they know who might be able to support them with placements or work experience. And as a result, people may never see their career as an opportunity or may feel lost in how they can achieve this. So, you know, you can see people trying for kind of years and years to get into the profession, and other people might, you know, come straight out of uni and straight into the first kind of step of the progression because they know people. So how can we level the playing field and increase people's knowledge of the career path? As part of our actionable insights, we're looking at increasing visibility of psychology professions as a career in schools and colleges. We also recommended easier access to resources relating to careers in psychology. And additionally, we're looking at a way of creating like a proxy mentoring system for those without traditional networking opportunities. So we also wanted to say, you know, something that came up is that there are strengths in having a working class identity. And this project isn't about reducing professional or academic standards so that working class people can get a leg up without meeting the competencies that are needed for this type of work. It's about reducing the inequalities that exist when applying, when getting experience for, and when entering the profession in general. So it's important to recognise the value of working class people within clinical psychology, within academia, and in other professions too, particularly in helping professions. So the value of having helpers that reflect the communities that they're working with and that they're supporting. So they understand and have empathy that comes from the psychologist or the helper, understanding the systemic barriers, the poverty or social injustice that people are facing. And that can be the validation and the alliance that the patient needs to then improve.
And then just to add to what Amy said about working class identity actually being perceived as a strength rather than maybe always as a barrier, it's important to recognise that the experiences of adversity or difference or systemic hurdles that working class people have faced also promotes like personal and professional resilience in the workplace. But it's really important that those individuals also have support along the way, so that, you know, overcoming all of these hurdles is very stressful, and as long as there's support along the way, we can take we can take pride in that and take the strengths from that. But it's important to make sure that they're not burnt out before they even start.
Okay, so just following on from those actionable insights, I'm just going to talk a bit about what's next. So recently we created a values and ethos charter as we kind of open it up a bit more. So we want to support a focus on equity and inclusivity within clinical psychology by opening up conversations about class and how this intersects with other areas of difference or marginalisation. We want to be accessible and jargon-free to raise awareness, educate and highlight issues. We really want to be brave and challenge the status quo. We want to encourage innovation and social justice by speaking up for what's right. We want to always be action focused. So we want to work collaboratively to support a more diverse profession, which we believe will help tackle wider inequalities and that marginalisation in our society. So we're going to continue to link with courses, universities and colleges to support working class students with aspirations of entering the psychological professions. We'll continue petitioning for meaningful change within our own profession, so encouraging recognition of the value of diversity. We're developing a kind of kit bag of resources to help and support people from other professions, so to enable them to host their own events similar to ClassClinPsych and develop similar resources. And we mentioned a bit about mentorship by proxy. So rather than duplicate the mentoring groups that are already out there, because they're very, very good, offering the mentorship by proxy via free resourcing, signposting, and collective action via social media and webinars.
Thanks, Liz. So I suppose just to finish up, that I suppose just the final message is just to, I suppose all of us are probably doing this, like, don't pull the ladder up behind you. We're really keen that this work lives on beyond the handful of us that are doing it within our own profession, but also, as Liz has said, we're open to kind of sharing our work and on our resources with other folks as well, if that's something that people would find useful. And just to wrap up, I suppose, just thank you for listening. We are on Twitter, and there's loads of links there to our past webinars, all our kind of resources and our mailing list. If you're interested, you can find us there. And then our position statement is also available. It's on ResearchGate, but there's also a link to it on Twitter. Also, if you don't use ResearchGate, because lots of people don't. And that is us.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic and right on time as well. Thank you, Ben, Amy, Celine, and Liz. Bang on, 5 to fantastic. So what I'm going to do is, for the next 5 minutes, just throw this out to the audience. Please pop any questions or any thoughts in the chat that's there on Zoom, and what I'll do is read those back to the speakers, and we'll engage in a bit of discussion. So I'll just give you all a few minutes to type the questions that you might have there into the chat. We've had some really interesting comments, lots of people saying, brilliant talk, so many things to think about, love what you're doing, congratulations. And yeah, I would definitely echo that. You guys are doing some really amazing work. Gavin says that a chosen career is also a really interesting phrase when talking about young people. You can only choose something if you know that it exists. And no connections means not knowing what could be possible, as well as not knowing how to go about getting there. I wonder if that's something you'd like to reflect on, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I the early conversations about this were basically me just being very angry all the time about it, because I grew up in a really deprived area in North Belfast, where you just never saw a psychologist. The idea that anyone would have access to therapy or anything else, just didn't happen. So I kind of navigated all these I don't know, hoops or whatever to get into this profession, and then got into the profession and found, looking back, that it was very hard for the ladder not to be kind of forced out from behind you. And I suppose that was just the impetus for doing this whole thing. And you're right, if you don't hear about, your mum's friend or your dad's whatever, involved in stuff, you don't hear about these things. And professions, as a whole, leaving behind kind of your working class kind of background and traveling into a new space, a new professional space, is difficult. But psychology, and particularly clinical psychology, is wild, because there's an unwritten expectation that you can work for free, that you can pay for a master's, that you can pay 40k for undergrad fees, that you can maybe work part-time in different places or whatever. And for the reality for a lot of people is that it's just is impossible, and there's no guaranteed outcome that you will get into training either. So there's some figure, I think it's like of the lowest socioeconomic group of people who apply for clinical training, like 8% get an interview, and of those 8%, 11% get a place. So it's a tiny
Minimal.
amount.
Yeah.
It's crazy, and the amount of, it's something, I can't remember the exact figure, but like for every one place on clinical training, there's like hundreds of people apply for it. You know, it's just, it's so brutally competitive.
Yeah, I can imagine. For sure.
And we talked a little, yeah. So but you know, there's I think just naming this stuff and bringing a little bit of action to it is probably, I think it's just been really helpful.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, we've got quite a few questions. What I'll do is we'll come to AJ. So AJ says, thank you so much. It was a really fantastic talk. I was wondering whether you have any thoughts about how widening inclusion with the profession will impact on the power balance within therapy for working class clients. It's a very good question.
That is a good question. And, you know, we were thinking recently about hosting a webinar on that topic. Like, you know, what is it like to be a working class person seeking out therapy? And maybe, you know, meeting a therapist who maybe doesn't quite get the nature of like kind of just social injustice and the impact that it has on your life. Now, I would probably caveat that by saying, you know, a good therapist will work on building the therapeutic relationship, and hopefully those things would be secondary. But I think where people's difficulties stem from inequality, that's where the rub is. And without, I suppose, a good understanding of that within the profession, that's going to continue to be an issue. And I think it probably is a bit of an issue. Well, maybe more than a bit, but you know, it's definitely a challenge. But it's something, those conversations are being had, but I suppose there's probably maybe a sense that those conversations don't lead to action. You know, there's a lot of reflection and a lot of thoughtfulness and, you know, all that lovely stuff, but it's less often tied to change.
Yeah.
Something being done.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Ben, and to the rest of your colleagues there, Amy, Liz and Celine. That was absolutely fantastic. There are more questions and thoughts and responses in the chat, so I'd say take a moment now to have a look through those and reflect on them. Yeah, fantastic. Thank you everyone for your contributions so far. Okay, next up we have Maria. Is Maria?
Yes.
There we go. Hi Maria. Okay, so Maria's going to be talking us through her presentation on how to valorize a working class experience, funds of identity and social capital for working class academics. Now, Maria's an associate professor and teaches at the School of Education at a university that I can't pronounce because my French was never very good at school. How is it? Aix-Marseille University? Yeah, there we go. And she holds a PhD in cultural psychology. So I will leave the floor to you now, Maria. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So this presentation is not a scientific one. I mean, it's really sharing perspective and reflection with you, considering to try to connect my personal background with some more social and collective reflection. So I would like to start with a little editorial that I wrote for this journal, Education in North, about a paper. So I would like to read, if you like. So my culture is that of the south of Italy, historical, more rural, isolated, poor than north of Italy, history of farmer, labour, woodcutter, as well expressed in the title book Formiche di Puglia, The Ant of Puglia, of the local author Tommaso Fiore. The ants are the peasant, the worker of the countryside, the starving. The dignity and the daily work of the so-called Icafoni, the rough people, working the earth and the stone, today attract tourists into the white and clean street of Puglia. Valuing the diversity of intelligence and different forms of knowledge remain a modern challenge. Entering in the educational world a separate reality from mine, assuming the complex social role of the student. Staying in educational system helped me bridge cultural and social gaps, overcoming monological proximity representation. Today, as a teacher-educator, I search for dialogical collaborative possibility between field, territory, subject, social status, cultural, racial, artificial separation. Multiple I think conversations are possible to be open through education. So I repeat myself, I must remember all the time that the real leap is to bring the invention into existence. In the world I pass through, I create myself endlessly. So this is just the first connection that I resonate with this conference. So I said my reality is really rural one in the south of Italy. So now it's a very glamour and a nice reason to spend time and holiday. I'm actually here in Puglia. But the reality is very different. I mean, the social background was very linked to the earth, to the working, the field. So now something resonates more in my experience. For example, I find very nice this idea that linked to the work of Fanon, Frantz Fanon, the personal path and professional path are sometimes we need to challenge to put. Sometimes we give so much focus on professional path, like I've done, and I didn't find until today, until this conference, give space to resonate more on the personal path that combine and give value and energy to the professional path. So sometimes, as you said in this presentation, in this taken from a nice video on YouTube, privileged people are more challenge to play as ordinary, and the privilege to be ordinary people. And sometimes people that come from a different background have this push to be remarkable, to be different, to be someone in society, to have a place in the society. So I'm now as a lecturer, I like to question what was my cultural capital and how this missing cultural capital from my development could have an impact in today. So for example, in my culture, in my community or my family, there is not so much reading culture, so it's something that they're acquiring. And I would just to share this, for example, Promises Pose is the main book written in Italy, for example, and I really remember the meeting point with this book in my scholarity. So it was something that makes sense. Start to shape my identity also. So also in my experience, the scholastic trip are the moment to explore region and territory around me, and also the influence of community and Catholic celebration, for example, is something to acquiring also cultural, capital cultural in my background, or as something that shape identity. So I find that this idea of fund of knowledge, fund of identity approach is very rich, and it's something that I would like to mobilize to think my academic identity in general, academic identity of people with working class background. So this idea of fund of knowledge, fund identity mobilize minority student identity in education setting to try to valorize social justice purpose. Two concepts related, the dark fundament of identity, defined as a problematic experience that individuals bring with them to make sense of theoretical concepts in the classroom, and the existential Fundaments of Identity, which is discussed by an author that was present today in this conference, so I was very happy to find him here, defined as the positive and negative experience which need to be appropriated by the student to express themselves and to grow as human beings. The need to valorize the individual identity, emotional, epistemic dimension in their living and embodiment in uniqueness. Students make a witness of their own biological, cultural, social development. So there are very powerful concepts that I consider very interesting to mobilize, to look the scholarity today and who we are in face during our teaching and learning process. Also in my case to have a lens to read my professional development as academic. Also I link this to this territorial identity that in my case is very strong and played a role in my trajectory, and I consider something that helped to shape this identity as academic, and not always questioning, but I retrace also in author presentation this territorially reference very strong and emphasized. So in my case, for example, some books from Italy very famous, like Formiche di Poli, already cited by Tommaso Fiori, give me already some point of contact with the cultural during when I start to interface with interact with the literature, because give me something back to read myself as part of this poor cultural of the Italy, and try to questioning my relationship with authority, with cultural, with social element, and then also this famous book of Gavino Ledda, Padre Padrone, resonated a lot also my experience, because give me back also this rural reality. Then we have, so we can discuss about social capital in social development, and the importance to be part of this epistemic community to help us to shape identity and professional path and development. So I start to question how all of this have some influence in my research today, and how shape our interest in some topics, and also because the social educational research, the researcher must be aware of the effect of the research, so how much all this rich background now can be valorized. So this is the two questions that I would like to organize also in some future research. And of course, I will. It's just open path for me of reflection. So how to valorize the working class experience in how to do social education research, and what bring us as working class academic to focus on some issues and not other. In my case, for example, I'm also a clinical psychologist, so it was very nice to see the previous conference and presentation about point in contact with me. So personal sense making shape academic interest. I will make an example, for example, from this text from Franz Fanon, this book, because I resonated too much about this idea of authority, that was very important for me. So, and the needs that we have to question more the relationship of knowledge and authority. For example, the idea that should the adult responsibility to question the authority received, put into perspective, justify it to himself or herself in this relationship with the student, I mean by this that I never really questioned my relationship with knowledge, with authority in scholastic path, but today I have more lens, thanks to the acquired social and cultural capital, to question my passive relationship with authority. And so I like the idea that we need to challenge this relationship that we had with knowledge, with the source of epistemic, the epistemic source of knowledge. So my personal experience now as a lecturer is very embedded in my past. So until now it's like not questioning, but now I can see the relationship with these two elements, and I would like to open this reflection to author and to improve also my quality of teaching and lecture, because I consider very very interesting and something to be open. So I propose to metaphor, just to thinking about this waffling activity. It means be an academic researcher could open us to this waffling activity. What it means? It means just the idea that as academics with a working class background, we need to make some action of orientation, decision, monitoring, recognition, like this activity proposed. And I made some interview with some colleagues that have my similar background, and I retrace in their biography, in their presentation, this activity, or try to make sense of the path. For example, these friends and colleagues say me, I've never been able to explain what work I do to my parents. Every now and then they make fun of me because I don't have a steady job. And when they worked, they took me, they started to work, and when they was young, they have more money of me doing unskilled jobs. I translated this from Italy, so the translation is not exactly. I sacrificed both salary and stability, economic and psychological, attracted by respect and admiration toward those I saw as point of reference and maximum aspiration. It means the authority of teacher, no, professor in academia. Unfortunately, this achievement outside the academic world are not worth much, at least for the human science. So these colleagues explain how he tried to connect his personal aspiration, this attraction to the authority represented by the social status of full professor, like maximum aspiration, and at the same time his background of working parent, this gap between these two elements, personal and professional, and how make sense and join also the conversation that we can have with the family to make sense of what we are acquiring in the schooling process, and make us in love, in reference, in aspiration to have more knowledge. So sometimes this gap also with family need to be questioning and monitoring and recognized, but also recognized. The second method.
There's just 1 minute left, Maria.
Yes, I'm just the second metaphor is about tinkering activity. It means the idea that find creative solution about the experience that we live also during the path to become academic, coming from a working class background. This is another example that show the anxiety to make sense, and with also the emotional suffering in this activity to perform the development. So to conclude, I really think today that working class background is a resource, and I would like to explore more how it can be used also to improve the quality as teacher and to do research today, because this learning process that we have performed to be academic is so strongly related to our identity. And I think that it's something positive that we have this nomadistic peripheral perspective that give us a outer lens to read, and also to project a society where diversity is much more valorizing. And like today is so powerful, the idea of network in confrontation with a similar experience. So this conference have already given me the opportunity to open with some colleagues and share with them and with you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. That was fantastic. So if anyone has any comments or any questions, it'd be great to see those in the chat function there. Bud Hall saying terrific piece, Maria. I definitely agree with that. And Bud has a question. So we'll come to Bud's first. It says, Dr. Maria, you said that recognizing and valuing diverse knowledges is difficult. Could you speak more to this?
Yes, I mean that it's very difficult to recognize from ourselves, ready for to be aware. I mean the path and the difficulty that we have done until today, and the importance to also to open to find similar experience and recognize in author the value of this experience. I mean, today I want really to see this weakening point in my past as something that is strong and important.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Are there any more? Okay, fantastic. Yeah, we've got another question here. This is from Eric Harper. It says, Maria, how do you think about class outside of the EU context? Is class a European concept, bearing in mind informal economy and poverty are the terms used?
Yeah, I'm familiar with Italian context and the French context. So I grew up in the south of Italy, so a very specific reality, and I'm not aware of the context, but for sure the social welfare of Italy helped me to have some scholarship and improve and arrive to have some support, a lot of support, sure.
Thank you. Right, fantastic. Thank you very much, Maria. And there are there's another question in the chat there, and there's a lot of congratulations and thanks for you to read from everyone in the audience. So I'll let you look through those. Next, we have Shona Smith, and Shona's presentation is on Find Your Voice, Lived Experience as Knowledge.
Thank you. Hi everyone, I'm Shona. I recently graduated with a Master's in Social Research, and yeah, this is my second conference, and for some reason I'm super nervous about this one, but wasn't about the last, so just bear with me. But yeah, I'm interested in how we navigate intersecting structures like racism, capitalism, patriarchy, and our lived experiences. But like more specifically, I'm fascinated by how we can unlearn these oppressive constructions and get back to the truths about ourselves, especially for those of us who have been historically erased by those claiming authority to speak over us. So yeah, as a biracial Black working class woman, this is where I focus my presentation today, in terms of what it means to know and also what it means to exist and experience. Laura, could you do the next slide, please? Thank you. So hopefully it goes without saying that I'm human. Researchers are human. Acting in an academic capacity doesn't mean we have a switch where we can flick off or on our emotional and personal selves for the sake of meeting the demands intersecting oppressions impose on us. We're not robots and our humanity isn't optional. So as much as I enjoy things like reading, writing, listening, questioning, discussing, I can't function without music, and I can't listen to music without dancing around my space. So I am, I guess, what you term a nerd with rhythm. Because yeah, I like doing things like writing parties, if you like, in my space where my music is up and I'm just flowing, getting my humanity present in the moment. But of course, I haven't always found it easy to be present. I'm also aware of the trauma that racism, capitalism, and patriarchy can have on lived experiences. and how exhausting that is to unpack it. So when I decided I wanted to explore what it means to be a biracial Black working class woman in Britain for my master's dissertation, using my reflections of the interactions I've had was something I thought about, but I had a lot of worries of doing that at first. I ended up having to sit with what I was really worried about realising about me, and whether the fears I had could bring me genuine comfort if I tuned into them. I found my doubts were actually doing me a disservice because I was quite clearly crying out to return back home to myself, in that rarely were the narratives I'd encountered about who I am my own. And of course, carrying out an autoethnography wasn't without its struggles in that respect, but this highly personal and highly social process of bringing myself into a socio-cultural context isn't something that I regret. If anything, it's something I'm thankful for, because now I actually get to look at myself in the mirror and tell myself that I'm committed to knowing myself in my wholeness. How can I claim to be my best self when I'm actively restricting my own access to truths? I don't think I can, and so we move. Can you do the next slide, please, Laura? Thank you. So what does it mean to know, and where does that insight come from in the first place? Well, if we go back to 19th century Europe, it's here that the turning point for how we appreciate knowledge today is often located. Namely, this modernity era saw emotive means being dismissed as irrational, which paved the way for things seen as providing a firm basis for knowledge production to be valued as rational. This, of course, included Western scientific thought and its emphasis on objective knowledge production. Leatherby, Scott and Williams expand on this further in terms of what this means for sociology. They mention how the widely accepted view of science is the means of securing truth about the world, which leads many sociologists to believe that sociology, along with other social sciences, should follow the scientific method. From this, then, we see how developments to knowledge during European modernity shape the dominant attitudes toward knowledge today. In turn, we see a hierarchy appearing about objective knowledge over subjective knowledge being set in motion by this intellectual shift, which assumes there is a single and fixed truth about us, which then has the potential to dismiss the multiple truths about our humanities. Can you do the next slide, please, Laura? So Western knowledge and erasure. Of course, humans aren't fixed objects to be observed. We're fluid and we're subjective because we each have our own identities and cultures which influence not just our interactions, but also our perspectives. Because nobody's really exempt from the socially constructed structures in that we're all ordered around them in one way or another. Hill Collins reminds us that no scholar can avoid cultural ideas and his or her placement in intersex oppressions of race, gender, class, sexuality and nation. So we have to ask ourselves who knowledge production prioritises and oppresses because of this. And Crenshaw's work on intersectionality offers us more guidance around this, because she demonstrates how being oppressed in one way doesn't necessarily mean you're oppressed in all other ways. So in that sense, of course, we should be aware of working class marginalisation, but when we centre on class inequalities, we need to ask who is at the heart of those mainstream conversations and why that is. As decolonial thinkers like Quadrano, Mignolo and Lugones discussed, capitalism, racism and sexism all underwent major developments in the 19th century. They're not new, but that was when they all seemed to redevelop, if you like. It means they're Western constructions and that they don't depend on each other to exist, although the fact that their enhanced developments happened alongside each other means their enforcements on our lived experiences coexist together. Next slide, please, Laura. Thank you. In that sense, can we really say that all working class people are cut from the same cloth? For example, while a report released earlier this year about working class pupils being let down may have been useful for pointing out the class-based inequalities imposed on working class boys, the report isn't without its flaws. As stated in the report, white working class boys lack privilege and education because of systemic inequalities. However, this isn't because of racism, which appears to be insinuated by criticism within the report about the effect pointing out white privilege in education has on white working class boys. Meanwhile, the experiences of Black working class people are erased because this approach can be seen to set in motion the idea that oppressions are individual rather than coexisting. And we see this further in David Gilbourne's point, where he wrote a Guardian article criticising the report. In this, he noted that since 2010, the Education Select Committee has conducted dozens of formal inquiries, but only 2 have focused on a single ethnic group, and both were about the white working class. And since the developments of racism and capitalism go hand in hand, in that racist definitions of us as the uncivilised opposite of whiteness intended to justify our ancestors' enslavement and therefore the denial of materials afforded to white people, I ask whether Black people's erasure in mainstream conversations about class is symptomatic of this historical context and its denial of our humanity. I also asked similar questions about the limited concern for girls in the report and Gilborn's Article 2, since the development of gender sought to biologically prove white men's entitlement to wage labour by asserting their strength in comparison to the emotive and nurturing femininity associated with white women and their domestic labour. I say white women here because a social construction of race exploiting Black people's bodies of proof of a barbaric strength results in Black women being alienated from Western definitions of femininity. Instead, we're told we're angry or the strong Black woman, and we're deliberately told, we're expected to overcome all the hardship that's deliberately thrown our way. Can you do the next slide, please, Laura? Thank you. So language is a place of struggle then. There's a reason that I'm deliberate about the language that I use, much to the dismay of those who produced the Sewell report earlier this year, I think it was last year actually, and called on us to tone down our language as we seek to liberate ourselves from racism. The section arguing that affinity bias is a better term for phrases like white privilege and white fragility immediately had me asking, better for who? Secondly, it's worth bearing in mind that any denial of privilege is symptomatic of the privilege you have. Clearly those who produced the report didn't get the memo, so yeah, read that again. Those of us who are subjected to historic erasure by the centrality of whiteness don't have this luxury, for the simple fact that its violence regularly rears its ugly head in our lived experiences, to remind us that it's there. And finally, I ask, how can we hope to change something if we don't name it? I refer to Bell Hooks' words on the necessity of an oppositional discourse to liberatory voice, because it reminds me of how possible this is, because language is an external to our social interactions. And when she says the thinking, the writing was an act of reclamation, enabling me to recover and to be whole, I always feel incredibly moved because the responsibility we have in recovering ourselves is clear. And for that responsibility to be there, it means it's possible. The question is, are we willing? Next slide, please, Laura. Thank you. I learned a similar lesson as I recalled my memories in the process of using autoethnography. When I remembered some of the most traumatic experiences of my life, I initially found I was telling myself to toughen up as I teared up and panicked. But of course, I'm not a robot, so the emotions didn't stop. I started realising I needed to sit with myself for a while, to ask why these feelings were there, to ask whose voice really accompanied the words I spoke to myself, and to ask whether they were really serving me. I sat with that for a while and began decluttering at my own pace. If they weren't my words and they weren't allowing me to meet my higher self, I learned it was okay to release them, to unpack them, to heal them, and to unlearn them. So in the same way that I realised it's not possible to change socially constructed systems we're not naming directly, I also learned it's not possible to connect back to the wholeness of myself if I'm not naming the aspects of myself that form my wholeness. And it's this realisation I find myself revisiting when I reread Audre Lorde's Conversation in Poetry is Not a Luxury, where she talks about how the white fathers told us, I think, therefore I am. The Black mother in each of us, the poet, whispers in our dreams, I feel, therefore I can be free. And I wonder if Lorde's sentiment demonstrates how oppressive forces and their violent exploitation coincide with our emotions, to condition us into portraying the emotive aspects of being human for the sake of normalising and preserving socially constructed structures. Next slide, please, Laura. Thank you. So bringing this all together then reminds me that power isn't a natural condition of being human, and nor is oppression. It's deliberately constructed, enforced and maintained. And by refusing to hear the multiply raised voices in discussions about systemic inequalities, not only is it violent and deliberate, but it also restricts any efforts to dismantle oppressive structures. How can we expect to dismantle socially constructed systems when we refuse to listen to the numerous ways they're imposing on the lives of every single person? Let's be real, we can't. So by refusing to embrace the multiple truths we have as human beings who are subjective, we do ourselves a massive disservice. Last slide, please, Laura. Thank you. So I'll leave you with this question to consider. Do you know who you are beyond who you've been conditioned to believe you are? Sit with that. It's not meant to be a comfortable question to unpack, for the simple reason that socially constructed structures of oppression aren't designed to offer authentic compassion. They won't hug you back, no matter how much you cling to them, because it's not in their nature. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Shona. what a question to leave us all with. Definitely a thing from one to reflect on. Let me just end the slide here. There we go. Okay, I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to pop their questions in the chat. It's been quite active over the past 15 minutes, which is wonderful. So we have Leanne says, to return back home to myself, which is a really powerful statement, and yeah, definitely is. Eric Harper says, truly wonderful presentation. Bell Hooks once said she was so preoccupied with race issues she forgot that she was a woman. Shona, would be interesting to hear more on your concept of better for who and your thoughts about the similarities and differences white and black working class experiences of being a woman.
I wouldn't even know where to start with that. I don't know, because I speak, as much as obviously race is about monoracial categories, I speak as a mixed race woman. I'm part Jamaican, part English. So for me personally, I know as a mixed race woman, when I went to primary school, for example, the majority of us who were on free school meals were mixed race. When I went to secondary school, it was exactly the same, which was quite interesting when I reflect on the fact that my secondary school was very white dominated. There weren't very many black people there. There weren't very many people of colour there. So that was quite interesting to me. And I noticed that when we have conversations about class, when I read things about class, it's, you have to make a point of pointing out your colour in that conversation because of this idea of white normativity, because whiteness is so central to conversations about everything because of, you know, Western constructed knowledge. When we have conversations about class, when we have conversations about gender, I can never just sit there and say, oh yeah, I'm working class, or oh yeah, I'm a woman, because I'm not just a woman, I'm not just working class because of this Western constructed knowledge. I am a mixed race woman. I am, let's face it, the world groups mixed race people as black. That's how we're treated. But we're treated according to whiteness's definitions of black, because black isn't naturally about being oppressed. It is constructed that way to make whiteness superior, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, the chat's really heating up. Everyone's saying, you know, fantastic presentation, so much to contemplate now. Really powerful, beautifully worded presentation. Gave me so much to think about. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so we'll have one more question, and this is from Ben. And he says, it reminds me of this quote from Bell Hooks. It's in the act of having to do things that you don't want to do that you learn something about moving past the self, past the ego. Yeah. Petitioning systems and systems of power to change requires confronting uncomfortable truths about ourselves. It's in the act of having to do things that you don't want, that you learn something about moving past the self. Yeah, that's fantastic, Ben. Donna has a question. Thank you very much, Shona. It'd be great to hear about what your next plans are.
Oh wow. I am actually looking to apply for PhD study next year. Yeah. I want to look at what it means to be a black woman in Britain. I really want to kind of amplify that, because I noticed that in a lot of black feminist conversations there's an American dominance, but of course there's different experiences in Britain too, and it'd be cool to kind of draw that in. I know people are doing that already, so there's like a specific angle, but I'm not giving too much away.
Fabulous. Right, well, we'll all keep his eyes peeled for that, because that'd be a fantastic project. Thank you so much, Shona. We're now going to move on to Lisa Kelly, who has a presentation called The Imprisoned Student. And Lisa has an absolutely fantastic t-shirt on today. If you're not angry, you're not paying attention. That's brilliant. Right, I will mute myself now and chat in 15 minutes.
Cheers, all right. Yeah, so I'm just gonna
share this now. One of the things, about the t-shirt, one of the things I found out when I started on my EdD study this year was that it turns out I'm a very angry person. I didn't know this. I thought I was quite happy. I thought I was plodding on in life okay. And I started thinking about things that have been going on in my career, in my education journey and things like that, and found that I'm actually really quite ragey, and that a lot of the time I'm covering up that with a smile, partially because as a girl I was always told to smile, partially because I had a job in the licensing industry and I was always told to smile. And it probably makes sense, therefore, that one of the key ideas that I've kind of stuck in with for my doctoral study, which I'm at the beginning of, and this presentation is really sort of a culmination of my sort of first year of observation, of building some ideas and really wanting to kind of air those and get a bit of feedback from people, a bit of bounce back, is this idea that actually we're imprisoning students through the experience that we create for them. So, you know, we kind of set up this whole scenario where we want students to actually be able to guide us through their journey, to tell us how they feel, but actually I feel that that's quite restrictive. So let's talk about that a little bit. So just to start off with, just so you get a bit of a concept about who I am, I had this history as a restaurant bar manager. I had my son very young. I've been a single mum for pretty much most of his life. In doing all of that, once I kind of got so far into raising him, I realised I couldn't cope with working the hours that involves. Even though I was on sort of a really positive career track, I was exhausted. I ended up having a series of jobs that were just not satisfying in any way, shape or form. And I went back to uni to study a degree as an adult. I'm actually now a lecturer on the degree that I did. So I'm a lecturer of English language on the BA Honours English Language Literature and Writing degree at Blackpool and Fylde College. I was the first person in my family to attend university. I then went on to do my Masters in English Language and Linguistics from Lancaster University. And I'm now currently undertaking my EdD at Liverpool John Moores. I'm receiving funding from my college where I work, Blackpool and Fylde College, in support of that as well. My focus really is about this idea of our customerization of students. You know, we use this metaphor to describe all of their experiences. We refer to them as a customer. We refer to, you know, kind of our customer experience aspects of the role, and, you know, kind of what the implication of that is for our students. Just to kind of start with, though, I actually put this in. I've changed quite a few things after listening to people today. I put this in response to the keynote this morning, just because I was thinking about how we were talking about how we have to kind of change the shape of who we are to kind of proceed in education. And Jackie Hagan, who's a poet performer, she's been on TV and that, she talks about dragging, you know, it being like the great drag act, that we drag ourselves from working class to middle class, that we change our accents. You know, not many people probably listening, apart from a couple of keen-eared ones, would probably recognise that I was from Liverpool, and that actually, you know, kind of a lot of concerted work was done to sort of hide that when we moved away from Liverpool not long after Hillsborough, and I had a bit of a rough time. You know, I was always told I wouldn't get a job if I still had a Liverpool accent. So from being quite young, I was always encouraged to kind of squash that, unless I've had a drink, and then no one can do anything about it. So in terms of the student experience then, I've been referring to it as a panopticon. Now, for anyone who doesn't know what a panopticon is, it's a system of social control that was designed by Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century. It's born of all these utilitarianism type theories of punishment. Now, the concept is that you have a prison guard and you plonk him in that central tower. So as you can see, hopefully in the image there, we have this roundhouse central watchtower. And the guard would sit in there, and the idea is the prisoners wouldn't really know when they're being watched, and therefore they're compelled to constantly behave appropriately because they may or may not be being watched at any moment in time. If you're not familiar with panopticons in this sense, you might be familiar with them in the Guardians of the Galaxy, because that was one of the features early doors. Now, in terms of higher education,
this is what I think that we're doing. I think we're putting student identity and the student sort of experience in the position of being both the observer and guard of quality. This means that there's an expectation students should know before they ever step foot in a higher education institution what they're going to get, what they need, what they desire, what they should be looking for, and what they should be demanding. Therefore, we then have to jump through hoops to ensure that they're getting what they think higher education should be. So there are some claims that this has this restrictive impact on education that focuses on transactional dichotomies, and this is kind of where my focus is at the moment, where people come in just to learn, to meet the requirements, to tick a box, to pass a course, to get something, rather than actually for the purpose of learning and for the purpose of engaging with the learning materials. Now, what is this prism made out of? Well, it's made out of a lot of frameworks that come from policy. So, we have this concept in our sort of, particularly in the UK at the moment, about value for money, about them creating this quality experience. And we ask students to police the quality through things like NSS surveys, through inspections, through graduate surveys. And this means that there's actually heavy consumer discourses at every level of the student experience. It's there in the external, in news reports, TV, the Guardian's kind of constantly talking about value for money in education. We've got the names of roles within institutions. We have customer services managers, we have business managers. So there's this over sort of business focus in terms of how we construct the background of our institutions. We've got the OFS frameworks, which have, as you can see in the image here, value for money as one of the key elements. And all students are talking about this, and this is actually what prompted me to actually go and do my idea. I have a student to thank for this, because at the end of COVID last year in May, we got a survey. And the student said, frankly, we know you've all tried your best, but if we're paying for this and, we're your customers, frankly, we're feeling a bit shortchanged. And that seemed really upsetting, because we genuinely, we'd gone to incredible lengths last year in a very, very short space of time to do excessive amounts. And being in a college environment, we were in a position to do a lot more than some of our university institute colleagues were able to do, because we already have a lot of support frameworks, being centered in a working class community, being centered in, one of the poorest, well, the poorest place in the country. We already had a lot of those systems in place, and we were able to get off the ground quite quickly. So this really started me thinking about this process, and I spent quite a lot of time last summer looking at what students were saying about their university experience. And these are just a few of the memes that were cropping up. If you're not familiar with memes, they're a really powerful, immediate way of communicating ideas quite quickly. If you want to test the temperature of the water, it's quite a good idea to go and look at what the general consensus in meme culture is, particularly amongst young people. And as you can see, a lot of these memes really center around what you pay and what you get, as if this was a direct transaction. Now, if you look at university funding, this is clearly absolutely not the way this works. The idea is that they get funding per student through the system, but then it gets distributed in different ways. And that's kind of problematic, because really it doesn't operate as a loan. It operates a little bit more like a tax. So this is the reality of loans. So firstly, when we've got students saying, what am I paying for? Only 12% of graduates are ever expected to repay their loans in full. 33% are expected not to repay a penny after 30 years. If this truly was a loan, it would be the world's worst loan system going. It's not effective, it doesn't work. The government constantly scramble to make up shortfalls. They're looking into this at the moment. It was always about trying to avoid calling something a tax. And this is what it really is. It's a graduate tax. So the context for that is students don't pay a penny until they're earning £26,000 a year, and repayments after that are proportional and are written off after 30 years if still unpaid. It's taken through the same systems as national insurance and tax. But loans, however much, I took my student loan, I have about £70,000 worth in student debt so far, or something ridiculous like that. This hasn't stopped me from being able to access education, but you can understand why this would represent as a barrier to people. Now, when I did my BA Hons, and I had my student loan in the first place, I also had a job and I was getting working tax credits. One thing that has particularly changed since then, which now makes the student loan system become more of a barrier than it used to be, is that they've started taking universal credit into consideration as income. They've started taking the student loan into consideration as income for people who claim universal credit. This impacts people with disabilities. This impacts people who have jobs and have been receiving stuff for having children. So any of you non-conventional students, which for me at Blackpool Macleod College is most of my students, this will affect their income if they go and take a student loan, and they can end up worse off if they actually go and access a degree, which for me is particularly problematic, but is also a completely separate presentation. I'd need another 20 minutes to talk about my issues on that one. So kind of coming back to the main point then, Bunce, Baird and Jones discuss the fact that student identity is actually a marker for success on degree programmes. And when we see an increase in consumer identities, we actually see the student identity of the cohort decrease. Now, obviously, this is kind of creating this really difficult paradox for practitioners, because we are judged on the success of our students. We're judged on their student identity, how much they associate themselves as students, how they relate to the course. And yet, though we're creating a system that assesses this, that is customerized. So it's almost setting us up to fail in the first place. Now, obviously, a lot of these funding changes were supposedly born of necessity. It was all about directing funding to institutions based on footfall. The idea was the student loans, people sign up, they get the student loan, it pays the tuition fee, and that way the university then gets as much funding for as many people as show up, and it kind of came in hand with the cap removal. As this was all coming in, higher education was added to the remit of the Competition and Markets Authority, and they state consumer law will generally apply to the relationship between universities and undergraduate students, as undergraduate students will generally be studying for purposes which are outside their trade or business profession. Now, this is a particularly sort of semantic thing. It sounds like, oh, well, we'll just talk about the words of being a consumer, but actually this kind of creates a certain way of thinking, and it does focus on this transaction of higher education. So if we think for a moment about some of the graduate attributes that we're supposedly meant to instill, things like teamwork, leadership and initiative, problem solving, kind of all those over engagement things, the idea that people throw themselves in 100%. And then if we look at the actual transaction of what we're focusing on, we're asking our students to choose a product, pay a fee, and then either receive an outcome, a service, or a product. But there's a whole load missing in here. If we had time, I'd start asking you what you think is missing, but I'm going to tell you. So what is missing here is, where's the learning? Where does the effort come in? Where does what the students actually have to do feature in this transaction? If we're supposedly creating all these engaged, forward-thinking, kind of motivated learners, that doesn't exist within this transaction, and we're potentially restricting their experience of the learning process. Now, there's been a response to the ORGAR report, which was the post-18 review of education and funding that came in really recently, so I haven't gone through sort of the full of it yet, because it was like 3 days ago. Current suggestions are lower fees to £7,500, cap admissions to certain courses. So sorry, arts guys, you're going to be the first hit because they're horrible in that way. Don't allow admission to higher education without a C in maths or English, which frankly, I don't need anyone to be able to add two to be able to do a decent literary analysis. So that's quite a frustrating one. We support a lot of people to get GCSEs at the moment whilst they're studying with us. And they're also looking at lowering the repayment threshold, which would mean you would have to start paying back your student loan when you were earning a lower income. A lot of these are problematic. It disproportionately impacts working class students. And Nick Hillman of the Higher Education Policy Institute said, in sort of response to people asking for bigger changes and different changes, perhaps when 80% of people go to higher education, taxpayers will be more willing to foot the bill. Until then, we need to find the least bad option, which seems to be asking the beneficiaries to pay a higher proportion of the costs. And obviously the beneficiaries, kind of where we're concerned, these working class people are going to be asked to pay more, and they're going to be the worst hit because they are the people who need the loans the most. So the problem, we need policy change. Any attempt of talking about this, if you're not careful, you get seen as a lefty. I get very angry about being called a lefty, not because I'm not, because I'm from Liverpool, working class, that's the way it lands. But because actually I just see it as a matter of common decency. If you're going to try and help educate people, and if we're going to change our environment and increase how much technology is doing work for us, people need to be able to go back and re-educate themselves and engage with adult education. So I find it very frustrating. It seems like a common sense approach rather than a particularly political approach. This separates the rich from the poor. So we have stratification of immediate fee payers. So in institutions where more people actually can afford immediately to pay for education, there is a stratification there. There's also this thing where it's not a policy that promises many votes to political parties, so people aren't engaging. And then we have working class communities needing the knowledge to navigate the system. So, we have all of these strategies for making room, like widening participation, but it doesn't educate people before they get there. So how do we create the sustainable environment to educate students in whilst mitigating the negative impact of consumer discourses? For me, it's about making these micro moves, doing things from the grassroots, and kind of trying to create something that almost develops a bubble that we can educate our students in, that sort of filters out some of what is going on. Because unfortunately, as a lecturer, I can't change policy. I want to get to a position where I can lobby for policy change, but at this point, I don't have that ability. So just because I always throw a Terry Pratchett quote in everything I do, this really kind of explains the approach I think that we need to take. Vimes found it better to look at authority for orders and then filter those orders through a fine mesh of common sense, adding a generous scoop of creative misunderstanding and maybe even incipient deafness if circumstances demanded, because authority rarely descended to street level. And this is the thing, we need this sort of filter. We need the mesh of common sense, and we need to be able to make actions. So at this point in my research, I've got the research and the discourse changes that I'm wanting to look into, but some key observations that we really need to be making sort of quickly. I think we need to be focusing on outreach with future students in mind, spending more time with schools and communities, communicating what university is, how to navigate it, teaching these unspoken codes that none of us actually understand or ever get. Until someone takes us to one side and go, oh, you're not meant to do that, because no one tells us when we're working class. We don't have parents, grandparents, uncles and aunts who can take us to one side and give us that information. We need outreach that has parents and families in mind. Some people don't end up going into education because their parents are distrustful of education. If I'd have listened to my dad, I'd have never gone into higher education. He kept telling me to go and get a proper job, which I did. It was only when my proper jobs kept letting me down that I made the decision, no, hang on, I'm not listening to that divvy anymore and getting myself back to uni. We've got to clearly map the journey for new students. We need to explain how fees work, the implications of them. We need to be transparent about the system and where the money goes, because realistically, not all the money that goes into a course, if it's a cheap course, stays there. It's probably funding something else. Honesty should not be seen as political. We should be transparent if people's money is involved. If it was a proper loan, we would absolutely legally be totally beholden on that. We should be lobbying for a reversal regarding the universal credit changes. That's something that is a real bugbear of mine. We need to become the village. We need to support colleagues with barriers. We need to advocate for level playing fields, and we need to share opportunities. And finally, the key one that I'm going to be working on through my research is disrupting the discourse by replacing it with a resilient one. At the moment, I'm thinking the likelihood is that if we can change language to reflect an investor discourse, which requires continued effort, continued focus, continued input, and that doesn't just simply mean financial, we might be able to create some sort of resilient atmosphere to support our students in some way, shape or form. And that's it. And I hope I wasn't too angry. I hope I haven't run over time. I totally lost track.
No, that was absolutely fantastic, and you were right on time there. Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Lisa. And yeah, there's no such thing as too angry when we're talking about issues like this. So thank you very much. Yeah, I'm just going to encourage the audience, if you've got any questions, any feedback, it'd be great to see that in the chat now. We've had quite a few comments come through already. So Jackie says, love it, Lisa, working class drag. We get so good at it, but it's exhausting and destructive. Yeah, and that's something that I can definitely I've definitely felt as well. So Donna says clapping and cheering already, Lisa. So there was a lot of love in the audience. Let's have a look at the questions. So Tracy says,
I've just seen Tracy's. Yeah, how do you manage your anger? I don't. I sit and smile, and then I get to a point where all of a sudden in my head, well, this happened the 2 sessions ago with some of my ED colleagues, and I just started getting really angry and saying, I'm sorry, can I just say something a minute? And about 10 minutes later, I was like, I'm sorry, I don't know where that came from. In reality, though, kind of joking aside, my research, I'm focusing on trying to develop a framework that allows you to weave sort of theory, your own context, philosophy, and policy in. So I'm looking at critical realism and looking at building. Basically, I've got a shape, and I've forgotten the name of it because I'm not actually, as I told you before, I'm not bothered about maths, and I forgot the name of the shape that I'm using because, the stress of presenting and the anger of financial issues. But essentially kind of having these key vertices that refer to kind of each element and how you bring them in and how you build that into a framework, because I'm sick of people telling me that I can't be angry, and I'm sick of people telling me that I can't care about things, and that's not professional, because it's actually something that's really important. And I've gone through that experience. I was lucky, for example, that universal credit hadn't come in when I was going through, so I still had the support of my working tax credits, my part-time job, and my student loan on top, which then paid for, it's the reason I have a Mac, because I was able to go out and get resources I needed rather than living off it. It meant I actually could buy the books that I needed and all that sort of stuff. So, I see these as really, really important issues, and I'm sick of people telling me that because I'm emotional about them, in some way that invalidates them. I'm emotional about them because I'm damn right. And I'm sick of being told to move over for people. And I'm not going to do that anymore. I think that's what the ED's taught me so far. I think I'm starting to find my voice, and I'm starting to realise that no one's going to open the doors for us as working class people. We've just got to go and bang the bloody doors down, and that's frankly what I intend to do. So yeah, to answer that, I'm going to stay angry.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, and it's a tiring process, isn't it? But at the same time, as you say, it's what we've got to do. Go and bang the doors down and create our own spaces. That's super important. Let's have a little look. Yeah, just got lots of really complimentary comments in the chat, which I'll let you look at now, Lisa. It's Stephanie made a really good point. Really enjoyed this presentation. I'm in the US, and student debt, the student debt issue cripples our graduates.
And you know, it's interesting with that because obviously the US system is particularly commercialized, more so than ours is. But the discourses travel over to our students. So we have our students changing memes that US students have generated. And there is a little element as a teacher where you do sometimes want to turn around and go, you don't have a right to say that. That's not your problem. Your problem's something different. I'll help you with your problem. But that's theirs, and theirs is worse than ours. I mean, theirs is just something else. When you can, you know, it can affect you not being able to get a mortgage and, you know, lose your house and car if someone comes knocking, if you miss a few payments. There's an issue there, isn't there, that's different to what ours is. But you know, they're just different issues, and I think that misunderstanding, because anytime America catches a cold, we catch pneumonia. You know, we kind of pick up everything that they're saying, and we take it on board, and that just shows how much our students who aren't from university families don't understand what the student loan system is. I don't think even all lecturers do, but because we have to work hands-on with our students because we're so close and we do all the pastoral as well, I think we see a lot more of it, and we end up being quite aware of the impacts.
Yeah, I think that's just reminded me. I can't remember who said it, but the UK is only ever one step behind America, and you can see that in the politics and how our politics sort of evolves in line with American politics often. Okay, fabulous. Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you to everyone who's presented today. It's been a really interesting panel. And thank you all for joining us, all the participants, and for the comments and the feedback and the questions. They've been fantastic. You've now got a 15-minute break, or rather a 20-minute break. And then we'll be moving on to the 5th session of the day, which will take us up to 10 to 7. So everyone go grab your coffee and get re-energized. See you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.